Hi, welcome. Okay, thanks everybody for joining us. And thank you for the reminder that you guys have given me to make sure everybody here knows who is attending live. There is a chat room, which is on our website, which should even be functional within a few minutes. So if you go to the Unfinished Tales page, the web page, just Google Mythgard and Unfinished Tales. And you'll find it. There should be a chat window there that you can use if you want to discuss with each other during class. If not, that's totally okay too. But just wanted to let you know that that was there. Also, I have another important announcement, and that is it is almost time. Of course, we are nearing the end of the term here. This is our antepenultimate class. We have 2 more classes after this, both of them next week. We have next Tuesday's class, and then our third and final bonus class in the Europe-friendly time on Wednesday afternoon next week. So, and that will be the end. Next week will be the end of Unfinished Tales. I'm knowing that I have 2 classes left. I'm sort of planning to go a little bit more slowly today. I want to spend some time with the Drûgs tonight, and I want to move on to. I hope to start the Wizards tonight, but I'm gonna spend the majority of my wizard time next Tuesday. So we've got between Tuesday and Wednesday to finish up the Astari and the Palantiri, and then to answer any questions that you guys have. So that's the plan. Now, since the end of this class is coming, that means it's almost time for the next class. So we have kicked our democratic process into gear, and just a couple days ago, the finalists for our next class have been officially decided upon by the Council of the Wise through their own internal democratic process, and the answer is our 3 finalists for our next Mythgard Academy class are Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card has been the runner-up in every election we've been doing so far, so I'm not surprised to see it be made a finalist again. Maybe it will finally be a bride and no longer merely a bridesmaid. So we've got Ender's Game, Watership Down by Richard Adams, and Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula Le Guin. Those are our 3 finalists. Voting is going on now. If you are a voter in the Mythgard Academy, then you can go. Make sure you go and vote. The other really important announcement, and it's actually connected to the fact that the website has just crashed, is we need to close voting a little bit early this time. We had been planning to keep the voting open through the weekend, but we're going to need to close the voting as of tomorrow night. So by tomorrow night Eastern Time, by midnight Eastern Time tomorrow, so that is by 11:59 p.m. on Wednesday Eastern Time, we're going to close the voting. Anyway, that's what we're going to be. That's what we're going to be looking at. You've got until then to vote. More than half, about 2/3 of the people have voted already, so that's good. But there's still time to influence the vote. We have seen some wild swings and dramatic comes from behind in the voting so far. So let's definitely see about that. But any one of these 3 should be a lot of fun. I like all 3 of these. Like and admire these 3 books very much. So anyway, how does one become a voter? Charlie asks. Well, I'm glad you asked. So basically this all began, if you've joined us recently, this all began last August when we did a fundraising campaign because we wanted to do these classes and make them open for everybody, but the classes aren't free to run. So, I've been, as any of you who've known me for a while know, that my own impulse is to give everything away. So I've been wanting to do this, but we couldn't do it. So we attached it to the fundraising campaign. So everybody who donated at least $25 became a voter. So basically, if we raised a certain amount of money, then we could have these classes. And the fundraiser was great. The support was just fantastic. We raised over $20,000 in our campaign. So we're able to do basically, a full year's worth of free classes with that, which is fantastic. But we're going to and then if you as I was saying, if you donate $25, you get to vote. People who donated $100 or more get to be on the Council of the Wise and decide and get a voice in the nominating and deciding of the finalists process. So that's how it works. As I said, we've had wonderful support, and that's been really great. There's still, of course, the fundraiser ended back in September, but you still can enter. We've had a couple people who have made donations. If you go, again, that same Unfinished Tales page on the Mythgard site, there is a link at the bottom. Is a big PayPal button through which you can still donate, and any donations that we still receive are sort of counted to. You can still enter in as a voter or a member of the council at this stage. So anyway, that is so that's how you can become a voter. Or if you're not a voter, you can just wait with bated breath like I am to find out which class we're going to be doing next. So that means, of course, that we should be able to respond to to you guys and tell you what we're going to be doing next soon, within a couple days. You can look for that on the Mythgard Academy Facebook page, and we will be, I'll certainly be announcing it next week during class. So, okay. So, as I say, we are getting ready for our next class, our next adventure, which will be a non-Tolkien book. That's not to say, of course, that we're swearing off ever doing Tolkien books again, but we did want to give non-Tolkienites an opportunity. So we're gonna do some non-Tolkien this time, and then we'll switch it up, and perhaps another Tolkien book will be a finalist next time. There have been several people who have been emailing me and saying we should do a History of Middle-earth series and just go through the whole History of Middle-earth series. That would be fun. I'd love to do that. That would take a while, but I'm game. But again, I don't decide. I myself have no vote. I have a certain amount of veto power, but I have no vote as to what we're actually covering. So I am a spectator of the process, as are many of you. So anyhow, let us return to Unfinished Tales. And last time we were looking at the Hunt for the Ring and the battles of the Fords of Isen, and I didn't get to so much of the Fords of Isen stuff. I did talk about it a little bit at the beginning of the class last time. There are a few things I wanted to come back and touch on. Two of them explicitly in connection with the Saruman and Gandalf stuff we were looking at, since we were already on the theme of looking at Saruman and the way in which Tolkien is sort of considering Saruman's character. I wanted to go back to that a little bit, because this is clearly one of the things that we can see happening in the Hunt for the Ring process, in the battles of the Fords of Isen, and then, of course, further in the Astari. Clearly, I've been focusing on Gandalf a lot, saying that obviously, Tolkien is continuing to think about Gandalf and his role, which is clearly true, but he's also clearly continuing to think about Saruman, and that both of these characters and their relationship is something which was clearly sort of on his mind, in which he's going and developing further at many points. So it's interesting here to see where how Saruman comes in again. So there we go. Let's see. Sorry, let me just do one quick thing here. All right. There can be little doubt that Saruman made his offer in good faith, or at least with goodwill towards the defense of the West, so long as he himself remained the chief person in that defense, and the head of its council. He was wise, and perceived clearly that Isengard, with its position and its great strength, natural and by craft, was of utmost importance. The line of the Isen, between the pincers of Isengard and the Hornburg, was a bulwark against invasion from the east, whether incited or guided by Sauron or otherwise, either aiming at encircling Gondor or at invading Eriador. But in the end he turned to evil and became an enemy. And yet the Rohirrim, though they had warnings of his growing malice toward them, continued to put their main strength in the west at the fords, until Saruman in open war showed them that the fords were small protection without Isengard, and still less against it. Okay. Of course, one of the things that I find so interesting here is the note that there can be little doubt that Saruman made his offer in good faith, or at least with goodwill, towards the defense of the West. And again, it's sort of tempting to take the Saruman that we know in the Lord of the Rings. I mean, we know that Saruman is a traitor, and read his treachery all the way back, basically throughout all of history. And there's even it's a natural question that even characters within the story have, right? Treebeard asks that question. You may recall. I wonder if even then, Gandalf and Elrond ask that same thing too in the Council of Elrond. Again, Treebeard's memories back. You remember when Treebeard is saying that his eyes were like windows with shutters inside. How do you read that? How is he reading that? He's clearly sort of in retrospect saying it's, having now seen that he's a black traitor, he's wondering how far back his treachery extends. Everyone is asking that question. But I think one conclusion we can draw from these other writings about Saruman here is that we can't just push it back indefinitely. Saruman just being a villain from day one is clearly not Tolkien's conception of him, and frankly a less interesting character anyway. What we get to see is part, anyway, of that process of his corruption, of his degradation, of his turning to the dark side. We don't get that dramatized quite as clearly as we see in some other cases, but we certainly do get more of a glimpse of it and more of an explanation of it in some ways than we got in a lot of the other writings, certainly in The Lord of the Rings. And this, I think, is a really interesting note, which really emphasizes something which I think is kind of latent throughout Saruman's depiction. One of those things which, once it's explicitly said, becomes really clear. And now you look back at all this other stuff and you're like, oh, it all fits into that pattern really neatly. With goodwill towards the defense of the West, so long as he himself remained the chief person in that defense and the head of its council. Saruman, you can say that Saruman's weakness is pride, that he becomes proud, and, pride is the great downfall of, most to all of Tolkien's villains, and so, there's no question that, pride is really significant in that way, and you can certainly say that Saruman is obviously guilty of pride in that same way, but I would not actually say that pride is his sort of chief vice, is his biggest problem, is what we seem to be given to understand is really the cause of his downfall. The cause of his downfall seems to be not pride, but envy. You could say, like, I want to be the chief person, and so that is pride, but no, it's envy, because he's always looking out the corner of his eye at everybody else. He's always comparing himself to other people. It's not that he feels like other people just don't respect him enough. He's worried that they're going to respect other people more. Right? It's Gandalf that really gets his goat, as we saw during the latter stages, from the sort of kind of cute, I think it's kind of cute anyway, that cute little sort of little private closeted hero worship thing that he does, where he's like, well, if Gandalf smokes, I'm going to smoke too, because all the cool wizards are smoking, right? And that's but this is envy. This is envy. And so, Arthur, yes, he does have pride. I mean, the desire to be seen as the head guy is pride. But again, with him, it's about how other people are looking as well. He is envious of the respect that Gandalf gets. He's envious of Gandalf's power, and what comes out from him, even in the Lord of the Rings, right? About Galadriel, how she always schemed for your part, right? He's always resented Galadriel because she liked Gandalf better. He's envious, right? He is envious of Gandalf's power and envious of his of the respect that Gandalf gets. So anyway, even to the point where, again, even in sort of these small petty ways, his relationship with the Shire folk, his discovery of pipeweed, even those small things are things that he can't just let Gandalf have all to himself. He must have them too. Envy. That's just classic envy. That, I think that just that one sentence there is a really interesting glimpse into what's going on here. But again, when he went to Isengard, he made his offer in good faith that he wanted to be in a sense, you could say although he made it in good faith, in the sense that he was really planning to fight against the enemy, he was really planning to be the ally and friend of Rohan and Gondor. Yet even the choice, even the setting up in Isengard, is itself conspicuous in this same kind of envy culture way, right? Like he can see that Isengard is crucial. It's like this strategic epicenter of this whole region. That there's a way in which even his desire to set up in that place, a thing which Gandalf never did, that is set up in a particular place, sort of allows him to be like, I am the tactical, the tactical, keystone of the entire arch of the Western defenses. And when that doesn't pan out, or when people forget that, or when when he ceases to be, when he's not treated that way, basically, he seems to get pretty mad. But anyway, yeah. Yeah, good. Yes, Tom, we see the same thing in Saruman taking note of Elbereth's comment, Varda's comment, that Gandalf is not the third among them. Yes. Yeah, Tom, I agree. I think that we can also see, Tom Hill was saying, his wish for the ring could be seen as motivated by envy as well. I think so. Even his scorn, the scorn that he heaps upon Gandalf and upon Radagast, right, in his speech to Gandalf that's related by Gandalf to the Council in the Fellowship of the Ring, that kind of sensitivity to rank that he shows, anybody... This is a rule a rule I've learned from the academic life. Anybody who's really, really a stickler about rank, about who outranks whom, probably has an envy problem, right? Anyone who is always counting, whom they outrank and who has seniority over whom, that's a bad sign. And again, I think in that same way we can see the way that he is sort of explicitly pulling rank on Gandalf and in absentia on Radagast, and scorning them again. It sort of shows the same thing. And Tom, I agree. Even his desire for the ring, then he would be able to dominate others. But again, then he won't have his rightful position, right? Then everybody would have to recognize that he is the greatest, and there's not going to be any more question about that. Again, that's what I meant when I said, this one little reference, for me, just kind of clicked a whole bunch of things into place. I had been kind of lumping Saruman into the pride category, and again, it's not that he doesn't suffer from pride, but I think that just this kind of helped me to see things, I think, in a pretty clear way. D-May says it sounds like her workplace too. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure it's I'm sure there are many professions that are true of this, though I've long concluded that envy is by far the besetting sin of academia. But anyhow, anyway, Paul, good observation. Even the business about Saruman, of many colors. There's this sense in which he wants to take the good of everybody else to himself. Right? He's not content to be one color in an array of colors. Right? He wants all of the colors. Right? I want everything that you have, and to sort of make it a subordinate part of myself. Good. Yana was just saying the same thing. One color is not enough for Saruman. Right. And it's not that a proud person might simply say, I am the white and that is awesome and white is the best. No, he's not content with that. He wants everybody else's stuff as well. Yeah, good. But another thing that the Battles of the Fords of Isen material is at pains to emphasize is the fact that Saruman, though he won both of the Battles of the Fords of Isen, really screwed it up. And in fact, there's that fascinating moment where he makes something like the argument, not that the War of the Ring was won at the Fords of Isen, but rather it could have been lost there, and it wasn't. Just as he said, just as it says in the notes to the disaster of the Gladden Fields, that the War of the Ring was lost pretty much when the orcs who almost annihilated Isildur and his men failed to recover the ring. So too, the War of the Ring was in a sense lost when Saruman blew it at the Fords of Isen. He had an opportunity and didn't take advantage of it. It was clearly seen in Rohan, when the true accounts of the battles at the fords were known, that Saruman had given special orders that Theodred should at all costs be slain. At the first battle, all his fiercest warriors were engaged in reckless assaults upon Theodred and his guard, disregarding other events of the battle, which might otherwise have resulted in a much more damaging defeat for the Rohirrim. When Theodred was at last slain, Saruman's commander, no doubt under orders, seemed satisfied for the time being, and Saruman made the mistake, fatal as it proved, of not immediately throwing in more forces and proceeding at once to a massive invasion of Westfold, though the valor of Grimbold and Elfhelm contributed to his delay. If the invasion of Westfold had begun 5 days earlier, there can be little doubt that the reinforcements from Aedoras would never have come near Helm's Deep, but would have been surrounded and overwhelmed in the open plain, if indeed Aedoras had not itself been attacked and captured before the arrival of Gandalf. And then there's even a note, right, where he points out that, and don't think that the Ents would have come in and changed it, because the Ents could have come through and annihilated the orcs in the open field, potentially, but even still, the orcs wouldn't have gotten there because of the timing, and when Merry and Pippin arrive in Fangorn, and when Entmoot is finished and everything else. Again, if they'd invaded in force, if that army had marched out 5 days sooner, then the Ents might have been in time to sweep Rohan clean of the orcs after the fact, but Aedoras almost certainly would have fallen. Theoden and Éomer would be dead, and you have no ride of the Rohirrim to Minas Tirith thereafter. So this was a huge screw up by Saruman. Now, what does this show us? What do we learn from this? Oh, great! Arthur has told me that the website is back up. Excellent, excellent. So again, if you want to chat amongst yourselves, go to the Unfinished Tales page, which is now available, and you can access the chat window. Okay, so Saruman proves himself to be a lousy general. And you'll notice how he is thinking here. This is especially interesting because it comes right after the passage which is talking about what Grima is up to, and how Grima is trying to neutralize or set against each other, or anyway, and basically his problem's Theodred and Éomer, right? If he can get rid of Theodred and Éomer, then he's pretty much got the country in his hand, with how he's got Theoden in hand. So, sort of knowing this, thinking this way, Saruman here, isn't thinking like a general. He is thinking like a counselor. He's thinking like a schemer, right? We've got to get rid of Theodred. So he has his leader, his captain in the field, throw everything away to go after Theodred, and once Theodred is done, he just sort of retires. He's like, okay, we executed Theodred, our work here is done. And it was obviously, from a strategic standpoint, a catastrophic mistake on Saruman's part to play it that way. So what conclusion do we draw from this? I don't think the moral of the story here is it shows that, Saruman actually was pretty dumb, or, he was just an incompetent military commander. It does show us that he was an incompetent military commander, but I don't think that that's it. I think that sort of what this shows is that it's the way that he is thinking. He's not suited to be a military leader, and he's not the only one. You think about sort of the way that this works. This is sort of part of, I see this anyway, as being part of a kind of a bigger theme of really a very large theme that we see in Tolkien's works, which is the way that good guys tend to operate versus the way that bad guys tend to operate. That really kind of one of the things which defines who's a good guy and who's a bad guy in Tolkien is their attitude towards others, right? We were looking at Saruman, his pride, yes, but also his envy. He doesn't want any peers. He does not want a colleague, right? He will not come down and help Gandalf, even when he's got no other future, right? Even when he really, he doesn't have a plan. What plan is he on? Plan C? Plan D by this point? Thinking back to the Hunt for the Ring. But anyway, he when the Ents have sacked Isengard and his army has been destroyed, and he is confronting Gandalf, on the steps of Orthanc there at the end of Book 3 of The Lord of the Rings. He has no good options. Gandalf gives him a chance, and a fair chance, as Gandalf says, but he won't take it. He will not work with anybody else. He will only command. And that's how the bad guys work. They will not work together. They can have underlings whom they can command. Remember again from the Hunt for the Ring, why are the Nazgul the best of Sauron's servants? Not just the most powerful, but the best? Because they're the ones that he can absolutely control. And he doesn't have to, he doesn't have to worry about them getting uppity and disobeying him or turning against him or anything. He can have absolute obedience from the Ringwraiths, and that's what makes them most useful to him. Saruman treats his people like that. We see, of course, how he treats Wormtongue, when they're together. But we can see even with his captain here, he's not working together with somebody, right? Saruman's not part of a team, right? He has given a direct order, which is a sort of a short-sighted order because Saruman is not a military leader. So he's given him what is really not exactly a military objective. And the guy, his captain, has followed it and then just does nothing because he has no initiative, because he's been given no initiative. Whereas on the other hand, you have, the good guys, you've got fellowship, right? You've got people working together. Gandalf has Aragorn, right? So he has, you think about how Gandalf doesn't go out to the battle, right? That was a moment, I talked about this a little bit, not quite as much as I wanted to actually, when we were doing the Return of the King class. The moment when Gandalf not just turns back from the confrontation with the Witch King at the gates of Minas Tirith, and that seems like a big deal, though it's of course kind of anticlimactic when it happens, right? The confrontation between Gandalf and the Witch King, there are some against whom I have not been measured, and here it is, right? This is what we've been waiting for, and then they just go their separate ways, right? And it doesn't happen. Not just that, but of course when he's done with Denethor and he's rescued Faramir, and he comes back and brings him to the Houses of the Healing, and then he has that moment where he looks out from the walls. The day is still young. There's still plenty of opportunity for Gandalf to go out and mix it up on the battlefield, but he doesn't. He won't, right? He says, no, my place is here in the House of the Healing. I shall have yet other charges soon. So he's going to stay in the Houses of Healing, and he's going to play a role. It's an important role, and it's a role that he sees that nobody else can play, right? I think the implication is that Éowyn would have died had Gandalf not stayed, had Gandalf not been there, and kept her and Faramir alive long enough for Aragorn to get there. Anyway, but again, that's exactly what Saruman's not willing to do. He's the boss, right? He wants to be the boss. He wants to be the center of everything. He wants to be like Sauron is, right? In command of everything. And obviously, he's not that good, but he's... But again, we see, would Gandalf be particularly good at military strategy? I don't know. We don't have any actual real reason to think that. But that's really... what I think we can see, when we look at the difference between Gandalf and how he sees his role in things, right, and how he relates to other people, he values what they do, right? He's thinking not of himself. He's not trying to sort of keep them down and elevate himself. Again, that's an envy thing, right? But rather he seeks to build them up and to inspire them and move them to play their part and to do their thing, and he will play his part. Anyway, that's yes. Yeah, good. Steve says we see also. Steve Hawley makes a really good point. Steve, I know I can always rely on you to make good observations when I talk about, military experience, of which I have none either, but of course Steve does, and I always appreciate your comments on these things, Steve. Steve talks about chateau generalship, a pretty scathing indictment from the ranks in World War I of leaders who led from the rear with no connection of reality at the front. Yeah, and of course, again, that of course we see as another big difference between Gandalf and Saruman, and between Gandalf and Sauron. Of course, you'll remember the passages in The Return of the King when Denethor is commenting on that about how Denethor makes a kind of a wry comment at his own expense about how he leads from the rear. The Witch King is leading from the rear and pushing his soldiers on in the attack and not coming forward himself initially. In the initial stages of the attack, Denethor he makes a fairly sardonic comment about how he's doing the same thing, sacrificing even his sons, and then when Gandalf says, "One has come to the battlefield whom I feared," he's referring to the Witch King, and Pippin loses his head and speaks up and says, "Not the Dark Lord," right? Like Sauron has come himself to the battlefield, and Denethor laughs at him. No, Sauron's not going to do that, right? He leads from the rear also. Why? Because he's preserving himself, right? He's not gonna put himself at risk, and the implication is that he would be at risk. But anyway, Saruman's not going to do that either. Gandalf does do that, right? Gandalf does actually do things himself and put himself in harm's way for the sake of other people, and for the sake of accomplishing what needs to be accomplished. So again, I think we can see numerous differences here, but again, also numerous reasons why Saruman is losing here. In the end, it contributes to his downfall, and that too is another major thing that we see, a pattern that we can see again and again in Tolkien's stories. Those sort of tendencies that make evil people evil, evil turns in upon itself, evil undoes itself, down to the very destruction of the ring at the hands of Gollum in the grip of the ring. We see that the power, the desire to dominate, and the evil desires of the evil characters almost always prove their own undoing, even if they don't literally, like Ungoliant does, devour themselves. Yeah, Charlie says, to be fair, Sauron has been killed in battle once already. Yes, true enough, exactly. See, who would want to do that twice, right? So, exactly. Yeah, okay. Let me move. There's a lot of things I want to talk about tonight, so let me move ahead here. Two other things. Those complete my Saruman comments from the Battles of the Fords of Ice, and two other things I wanted to touch on. One briefly, one thing that he expands on a little bit from the Lord of the Rings, which is Theoden's condition at the hands of Grima. This occurred early in the year 3014, when Theoden was 66. His malady may thus have been due to natural causes, though the Rohirrim commonly lived till near or beyond their 80th year. But it may well have been induced or increased by subtle poisons administered by Grima. In any case, Theoden's sense of weakness and dependence on Grima was largely due to the cunning and skill of this evil counselor's suggestions. It was his policy to bring his chief opponents into discredit with Theoden, and if possible to get rid of them. It proved impossible to set them at odds with one another. Theoden, before his sickness, had been much loved by all his kin and people, and the loyalty of Theodred and Éomer remained steadfast, even in his apparent dotage. Good. Sorry, I was just looking at... Okay, I said I was done with Saruman, but Tom, I will read your comment, because it's Arthur, referring to the death of Sauron, says he's got 9 more fingers. What's he worried about? Anyway, Tom says, if envy is Saruman's besetting sin, that makes Saruman's remarks to Gandalf that if they joined Sauron they could work together to undermine him and come to use the ring seem a revelation of his character. Who is this we? Gandalf rightly asks. We know it doesn't work that way. Right, exactly. And, Tom, the error that Gandalf catches him out on, right? Only one hand can wield the one, right? Gandalf, says, look, what you are saying not only is contrary to everything else that nobody who makes the kind of arguments that you've been making, nobody who advocates the kind of course that you've been advocating actually is interested in that kind of teamwork, right? So I already disbelieve this, but you've totally given it away when you're going to try to pretend like we're going to share the one ring. It's totally illogical, and you've absolutely exposed yourself. So yes, Tom, I again see, you see how that concept just kind of works backwards through all of those other quotations and sort of makes them fit in. This, by the way, if I could just pause for a second here, is one of the things that I think we can see happening in most of this later material here in Unfinished Tales. It's not just about Tolkien adding more details or answering questions that have come up. Those things are clearly part of it. It's not just Tolkien sort of indulging himself, though I think that's part of it too, in sort of telling stories he hadn't told, or giving details of, sharing details of things that he had worked out that people seem to have questions about, whether it's, how the Ringwraiths found the Shire, or who exactly was the squint-eyed Southerner. However, I think in a larger sense, Tom, thinking about, again, that example that you were just giving, one of the things that we can see is sort of Tolkien reflecting on what he's written and kind of crystallizing some of this stuff and really shining a kind of light upon it, which really shows it up in a different way. Sometimes it can have a transforming effect. I think the Isildur story is an example of that, where what we see, the light that we get upon Isildur's character in The Disaster of the Gladden Fields, really changes how we should go. I mean, if we keep that story in mind as we read through The Lord of the Rings, our impressions of and understanding of Isildur are really quite different. But there are other places where that transformation is less severe. And I think that that's really fascinating. And again, as I've said before, I think that there are numerous places here in these later essays and stories where we can see Tolkien doing really careful reading of his own text. That's something that he clearly invests in a lot. That's how he approaches this whole project in these stories. But okay, so anyway, thinking about that, Theoden's condition. This is another of these things that we see here, where he is inviting us to look at this a little bit differently. Arthur, I had exactly that same reaction. Poisons, right? That to me is sort of the new thing here. If anyone remembers something I don't, which is possible, I often forget things, tell me. But I don't recall any reference of anything like this. That Theoden's condition was sort of a purely psychological. It's not even obvious. I mean, there's several places in Tolkien where it's not clear to what extent magic is happening, right? Thinking of Galadriel's words to Sam and Frodo about magic and what do hobbits mean by that word, where something that we might call magic is occurring. It's unclear. And although I always found, and still find, the Peter Jackson film Exorcism of Saruman version of the healing of Theoden to be slightly comical and overdone, nevertheless, I can understand why they went there. Because what's there in the book would be really hard, especially hard, I think, to put on the screen, because it is really, really ambivalent, right? It's hard. It's unclear. When Gandalf heals him, is he performing magic? I think. Anyway, it's difficult. It's difficult. Here, he's going back and now he's doing something which it doesn't generally do. And that is give a sort of mechanical explanation. That is to say, he looks back and he doesn't... one could almost call it explaining away what Grima did, right? Again, I'm not trying to guess what was in Tolkien's head here, but if we were in uncertainty, was Grima doing something magical? Was he just a really cunning talker? Had he just, was there some kind of like semi-hypnosis thing? Was he just, he deceived him, yeah, but it seemed to be a physical thing. How do we understand this? Well, he's kind of thrown us a line here, and says, hey, subtle poisons, right? That there was a physical means to it. There is still, the question of his will exerted over Theoden's and his sort of, caging and ensnaring of Theoden's will by his own cunning. That's still present, right? We're not removing that. But if we found the situation hard to understand, hard to visualize, hard to really put our finger on what precisely Wormtongue was doing to Theoden, we've got a little help if we want it, right? It's a fascinating move. This is not the kind of move I think that we see very often in these later stories, but that I found particularly interesting. Even the possibility that he raises that his malady may thus have been due to natural causes. So we have basically 3 options here that we can, which none of which has been definitively asserted. We can either choose to believe that Grima simply exerted his will over Theoden's and in some sense ensnared his will by a kind of magical force which is like to and probably derived from or derivative of, in any case, Saruman's the power of Saruman's voice, right? Grima as a kind of an echo of Saruman's voice, and and exerting a power that's like the power that Saruman can exert over the hearts of people. So that's one way we can understand that. If we want to understand it as him actually administering physical poisons to debilitate him and weaken his mind, and then to confuse and to deceive him, by his cunning, that's the other option. And the third option is simply that he actually was sick, that his malady had natural causes, which Grima simply took advantage of, right? And that the debilitation which was brought about by his natural causes provided the opportunity for Grima to confuse and confound and deceive him. And with any one of those 3 options, Gandalf's arrival and healing can easily fit, right? If either of the latter 2, that is, either if it's a malady of natural causes or if there are subtle poisons involved, we would have Gandalf performing a physical healing upon Theoden, which is consistent with the language of the text. There's all that talk about leechcraft, right? And Gandalf's power of healing, consistent with what we see there. If he neither has a natural malady nor has been poisoned, but it's this purely sort of spiritual oppression that Grima is working upon him, then Gandalf bringing the light in is the easier to understand in that way. I don't. But again, it's fascinating. We're not being told like, okay, here's what was really going on, right? But it's suggested, it's kind of thrown out there. And I think the non-definitive nature of this passage is, to me, one of the things that's most fascinating. Yes, as Alyssa is pointing out, a couple other people have mentioned, Sarah Martin has mentioned that at the same thing too, at almost the same time. The word poison is used, but only metaphorically. Do you think Wormtongue only had poison for Theoden's ears? Gandalf says to Éomer in the Houses of Healing, right? but it's poison for the ears, and presumably not in the Macbeth sense of literally pouring poison into the porches of anybody's ears. So the poisoning and the healing could both be metaphorical, or at least both be understood sort of spiritually, psychologically, emotionally, rather than physically. But, Don, great question. Don says, are we to connect the worm in Wormtongue with dragons? Yes, absolutely. I went around for many years. I mean, when I first read The Lord of the Rings when I was like 8 or 9 years old, and for years I understood Wormtongue. I mean, I never thought about it all that much, but looking back on it, I can recall the mental image that I had from that, because I had no idea that dragons were called worms. I think of those references in C.S. Lewis's Voyage of the Dawn Treader about how Eustace had read none of the right books, right? Well, except for the Chronicles of Narnia and Tolkien, I had read none of the right books either, so I didn't know what a worm was in that sense. I know, I know it's referenced like, Bilbo calls Smaug a worm in The Hobbit, but I was obviously not reading closely enough or thinking about it. But I just thought it meant like an earthworm, basically. Which is a disgusting physical image, that if he has like a tongue is like a worm. And the word is used in something like that sense, right? I think that I thought of it only in like the earthworm sense, because when Gandalf is insulting him, he says that, a worm you have become. Anyhow, oh, sorry, did I say Macbeth? Guys, I meant Hamlet. Yeah, thank you. Both Charlie and Nancy have corrected me. I apologize. I need to get more sleep. Yes, Hamlet is, of course, what I was thinking of. Anyway, yes. The fact is that Wormtongue does mean dragons, like the tongue of dragons, which are famously silver-tongued and deceptive. It is a testimony to the power of his speech, the power and fluency and deceptiveness of his speech. In that sense, he is Wormtongue. And this is why the word is not simply an insult. Again, like I was sort of, I took that term to be simply a term of abuse when I first understood it when I was a kid. It's not just a term of abuse. It's a term of, there's still some abuse there, but there is a kind of backhanded compliment to it, right? But anyway, Neil, exactly like Glaurung. So yes, that is definitely the sense of it. Good. And Faye, I agree that the idea of Grima's having some kind of primary world magic, or secondary world magic, but anyway, within his primary world, right? That is to have some actual potency to his will in this way, that does seem relevant. It does seem possible, that he is under Saruman, wanting the dominion of things and wills, as Faye says. I agree, it's the line between what is magical and what is not magical is so fuzzy so often in Tolkien, that I think it's tricky, but Okay. Let's see. Kay says, "Is Grima to Saruman what Saruman is to Sauron, and Sauron is to Morgoth?" Kay, yes. And by the way, Kay, welcome back. I haven't seen you in forever. I know you've been busy. I'm glad you were able to join us. But anyway, certainly in the sense of emulation, right? Certainly in the sense of, the lesser following the greater. Though, of course, in one sense, Saruman is not necessarily that much lower than Sauron. And we'll get into that next time. But yeah, I mean, Cam, I'm hesitating a bit about a straightforward sort of analogy there, because there are many ways you could take it in which it's not true, of course. I mean, Saruman was certainly not relating himself to Sauron in the way that, that Grima was relating himself to Saruman, and yet you could say that there is a parallel in the sense of the lesser, less powerful one who is trying to do the things that the greater one is doing, and also ultimately kind of deceiving himself too. Yeah, Annie says Grima is much more faithful, where Saruman was using Sauron as a means to an end, perhaps. Well, the bad guys are generally, by definition, using each other as a means to an end. But you're right that there is faithful service of Grima to Saruman, as there was faithful service of Sauron to Morgoth. Remember the reference in the Silmarillion to how he was only less evil than Morgoth, in that he for long served another, right? But again, that relationship certainly doesn't work between Saruman and Sauron in that same way. But there certainly are some similarities. I mean, there are definitely things that you can kind of tease out there. All right, one last thing, and this is very short. They stooped then to lift the body, and found that Theodred still breathed, but he lived only long enough to speak his last words. "Let me lie here, to keep the fords, till Éomer comes." Night fell. A harsh horn sounded, and then all was silent. The attack on the west bank ceased, and the enemy there faded away into the dark. The Rohirrim held the fords of Isen, but their losses were heavy, not least in horses. The king's son was dead, and they were leaderless, and they did not know what might yet befall. I just wanted to just read this briefly. I had made reference earlier in last class to the fact that, we so seldom within the Lord of the Rings itself do we see any kind of, sort of dispassionate attention to tactical maneuverings in a battle situation, and his emphasis, the emphasis of, we're looking even at sort of the differences in prose style in his description of the, the ebbing and flowing of the battles of the Fords of Isen compared to the descriptions that we get, of the Battle of Helm's Deep and of the Battle of Pelennor Field, and even of the Battle of Five Armies in The Hobbit. But here, of course, we get a taste of that tone that we're more familiar with, even of that paratactic style that I was talking about. The Rohirrim held the fords of Isen, but their losses were heavy, not least in horses. The king's son was dead, and they were leaderless, and did not know what might yet befall. That, again, it's just a little taste of it, right? It's not like the charge of Theoden onto the Battle of Pelennor Field, but this is certainly a moment in which we sort of see, even this is still essentially rough draft that Tolkien is writing here. This is far from a polished, completed narrative, but yet even here we can see sort of his ear for this tone, which he's so good at, coming out. And I just like, Theodred's last words, and then that's the simple, the sort of the rhetorical power of Tolkien's short, simple sentences. Night fell in the middle there. And then the image, a harsh horn sounded, and then all was silent. So good, man. That's just fantastic. Yeah, good. Carolyn was just pointing out the same thing about the great Tolkien short sentence there in the middle. Absolutely. Exactly, Brian. Just like "and it stank." Precisely. Though, of course, here the effect is very different, right? Night fell. It's just great. And I also, for similar reasons, I like the description of Grimbold fighting his way up to Theodra's side. Just too late. Very good. But anyway, so even in this kind of a place where he is interested in doing the other thing, that is where the story is interested in telling us in this much more detached, hypotactic way about what happened in the battle and everything, he still has these moments. Okay. Faye, great observation. We'll end with Faye's observation here. Theodred's last words, and then the note about it, then the note about the bare hill. It needed no guard. It is almost like now comes the night, but with hope. Yeah, it's kind of like day will come again, right? Yeah, there is a kind of day will come again, I think, about this. Okay, but we were talking about 2 chapters tonight, theoretically, the Drúedain and the Astari, and I promised to get to at least one of them tonight, in fact. So let's do that. Let's talk about Drûgs. I love the Drûgs, and it seems pretty clear that Tolkien did too. The first thing I want to say, actually, even before we read this passage, the first thing that I want to emphasize here is that this is another example, again, when you look chronologically at Tolkien's composition of this stuff, this is clearly another example of an idea, a concept which has emerged in the process of the writing of The Lord of the Rings, which Tolkien then really likes and really sort of seizes onto. The biggest example of this, of course, as we've talked about before, is Galadriel, who doesn't exist before The Lord of the Rings, but becomes a favorite once The Lord of the Rings comes in. Khan Buri Khan is the beginning, right? So don't, again, keep the chronology straight. When you're reading the stuff about the Drúedain, don't be thinking, this is where Khan Buri Khan comes from. No. Khan Buri Khan is the original. Notice how I'm trying to do his name, which I find very difficult, but I've been practicing. Khan Buri Khan is the original, and the essay of the Drúedain is based on him. So anyway, it's and again, this is another. And if you think about Khan Buri Khan and what we see of him in The Return of the King, right? I mean, there are a bunch of things that we get from him in almost every element that we see in his description, that we learn about him during the course of his interaction with Theoden and Éomer, that we hear about him from Elfhelm. Almost every reference to the wild men and to Khan Buri Khan himself is integrated into this essay. We see these things being developed further, and made a good deal more of. Yana, I know. Well, Yana, I think about it the other way around. Yana says I need to learn Dutch, and then it would be much easier to say his name. Yana, I think about it the other way around. That by practicing saying Khan Buri Khan's name, I shall be the more readily prepared to learn Dutch when the time comes. Yeah, good. Now, yes, Kay, you're right, and Hebrew also, yes. No, there are a bunch of languages that have that. Though the problem I have is not with the unvoiced version, with just the, I can do that. But it's the voiced version, which I think is what the GH is supposed to be. It's not the sound, but the sound. That's the thing. And I'm just like, whoa. I remember the first time I almost injured myself. The very first time I tried to make that consonantal sound, I was reading the appendices of The Lord of the Rings, and I was like a voiced back spirant, and I'm like, okay, the back spirant I knew was, but anyways, I'm like, voiced? Yeah, you can do that voiced. Anyway, it's a fun challenge. Well, let's get to the way we have. So with Khan Buri Khan as the sort of the icon of the Drúedain, and then we get now the picture being the picture being filled in. Tom, that's a good way to think about it. Think about humming while making the sound. Yeah, that I hadn't thought about it, Tom. But that is kind of what I'm doing. Okay, the strangest of all the customs of the folk of Halath was the presence among them of people of a wholly different kind, the like of which neither the Eldar in Beleriand nor the other Atani had ever seen before. They were not many, a few hundreds maybe, living apart in families or small tribes, but in friendship as members of the same community. The folk of Halath called them by the name Drûg, that being a word of their own language. To the eyes of elves and other men they were unlovely in looks. They were stumpy, some 4 feet high, but very broad, with heavy buttocks and short, thick legs. Their wide faces had deep-set eyes and with heavy brows, and flat noses, and grew no hair below their eyebrows, except in a few men who were proud of the distinction. Khan Bore Khan, of course, has a beard. A small tail of black hair in the midst of the chin. Their features were unusually impassive, the most mobile being their wide mouths, and the movement of their wary eyes could not be observed save from close at hand, for they were so black that the pupils could not be distinguished, but in anger they glowed red. Creepy. Their voices were deep and guttural, but their laughter was a surprise. It was rich and rolling, and set all who heard it, elves or men, laughing too, for its pure merriment, untainted by scorn or malice. In peace they often laughed, at work or play, when other men might sing. But they could be relentless enemies, and when once aroused, their red wrath was slow to cool, though it showed no sign, save the light in their eyes, for they fought in silence, and did not exult in victory. Not even over orcs, the only creatures for whom their hatred was implacable. Okay. Of all of this, I would say there seems to be one element which seems to be an improvement upon the Lord of the Rings description of the wild men. And that is, Kay says, minus the chin tail, this sounds like my infant son in some moods. Yes, though I wish my infant sons had been this impassible, frankly. But anyway, that whole thing about like standing perfectly still for a really long time, what I wouldn't have given for that. But anyhow, the one thing which seems, in all of this, which seems to me as actively inconsistent with the description in The Lord of the Rings, Christopher Tolkien quotes it but doesn't comment on it at all. I think because it's not really very consistent, and that's the laughter. Hanbury Khan's laughter is commented on, but it doesn't sound like that, right? He makes this gurgling noise in his throat, and Mary doesn't even know what it is at first, then he realizes, oh, he's laughing, right? So the fact that his laughter was strange is one thing, right? But then the way that he takes the strangeness of the sound of his laughter and pushes it in this new and I think really fascinating ways. The rich and rolling laughter that set all who heard it, elves or men, laughing too for its pure merriment. If it sets elves and men laughing who hear it, I can't imagine it wouldn't set a hobbit laughing who heard it. And it definitely didn't have that impact on Merry. But again, I think that this is something that is one of a couple ways, very few, I think, in the instance of the Drúedain, but one of the ways in which he's pushing the idea forward a little bit further, where he is investing that previous detail from The Lord of the Rings, the laughter, with a different kind of impact that it doesn't initially have, which is fine. I think that's cool. The relationship with orcs is fascinating. We don't have time right now to talk about orcs and their origins. It is an extremely thorny subject. Of course, the published Silmarillion says they're derived from elves, but as Christopher notes in his commentary on this passage, there was a lot of... Tolkien went back and forth a lot on that. He had a lot of different ideas that he suggested at different times about where the orcs came from. If ever we do in the Mythgard Academy, if ever we do a class on Morgoth's Ring, we'll talk about it then. And I promise we'll come back to this passage when we get there. But certainly the suggestion of a kinship between the orcs and the Drûgs is a fascinating idea. And even there, you just sort of think about what the possibility of that connection suggests, the way in which the Drúedain, in which the wild men of the woods, what a minor place they fill in the world of Middle-earth as it's revealed in The Lord of the Rings, right? It's not, they play an important role in the story, but they're a really minor character, right? And the idea that he's going to go back and invest that little tiny piece of his whole sub-creation into such a big, to make them the source of the orcs, that's a really big deal. So anyway, yeah. So I think, again, it's a fascinating instance of a way in which, through these later essays, we can see Tolkien going back and investing these things with much more sort of stature than they had at other points. A couple comments you guys are making. Several of you have pointed out sort of similarities, apparent similarities between the Drûgs and, at least, as Carolyn says, the modern view of Neanderthals. Yes, there does seem to be a kind of similarity. They certainly look as if they were sort of primitive. We would use that word in some sense or other. Arthur says, I'm intrigued that Eru makes modern evolved men and also creates what appears to be Neolithic men simultaneously. Yes, the changes among, or rather within, the physical and racial changes within the race, the species of humans in Tolkien's world is a really interesting kind of subject. And I want to come back to that, actually, in a kind of a roundabout fashion. Let's compare this, of course, with another description. They are, or were, a little people, about half our height and smaller than the bearded dwarves. Hobbits have no beards. There is little or no magic about them, except the ordinary everyday sort, which helps them to disappear quietly and quickly when large stupid folk like you and me come blundering along, making a noise like elephants which they can hear a mile off. They are inclined to be fat in the stomach. They dress in bright colours, chiefly green and yellow, wear no shoes, because their feet grow natural leathery soles, and thick, warm brown hair like the stuff on their heads, which is curly, have long, clever brown fingers, good-natured faces, and laugh deep, fruity laughs, especially after dinner, which they have twice a day when they can get it. Now you know enough to go on with. Now, I am not, of course, suggesting that Drûgs are hobbits. I'm not suggesting no identity between the two of them. The differences between them are quite clear. However, what is kind of interesting to me is the similarity in the description here. That it's impossible for me not to think of this passage when I'm reading that passage describing the Drûgs. Hobbits are similar to the Drûgs in one sense, in that they seem to be some kind of mannish subspecies, and the ways in which they differ are intriguingly parallel, even though quite different from themselves. That is, they're both short, for one thing. Okay, that's an obvious similarity. They are follicularly distinguished from other human beings. Hobbits, because they have exceptionally furry feet, and Drûgs, because they have no hair south of their eyebrows, right? Both of them have a hair distinguishing. Okay. Again, even the things that get emphasized, their laughs, right? Their shape, hobbits tend to be fat in the stomach, or they're just kind of pudgy, instead of stocky and really broad and strong like the Drûgs. But I guess hobbits' laughs are fruitier, and the Drûgs are more rolling. But again, the similarities in the details that are touched on are, to me, kind of fascinating. And even just sort of as two different kind of parallel subspecies of humans, it's kind of fascinating to put them next to each other. Now, again, Tolkien is really clear. Christopher Tolkien goes out of his way to emphasize that the Shire is a Droog-free zone. My father was at pains to emphasize the radical difference between the Drúedain and the Hobbits. They were of quite different physical shape and appearance. The Drúedain were taller and of heavier and stronger build. Their facial features were unlovely, judged by general human standards, and while the head hair of the hobbits was abundant but close and curly, the Drúedain had only sparse, lank hair on their heads and none at all on their legs and feet. No confusions here. They were at times merry and gay like hobbits, but they had a grimmer side to their nature and could be sardonic and ruthless, and they had or were credited with strange or magical powers. They were moreover a frugal people, eating sparingly even in times of plenty and drinking nothing but water, very different from hobbits. In some ways they resembled rather the dwarves, in build and stature and endurance, in their skill in carving stone, in the grim side of their character, and in their strange powers. But the magic skills with which the dwarves were credited were quite different, and the dwarves were far grimmer and also long-lived, whereas the Drúedain were short-lived compared with other kinds of men. Sarah wonders if Drûgs would be similarly resistant to the ring. Don't know, Sarah. I haven't the faintest idea. If I'd had to guess, I'd say yes, but who knows? One of the things that I find fascinating here is, and they had or were credited with strange or magical powers. That is, Drûgs are, in contrast to hobbits, of course, as Christopher Tolkien is suggesting. Well, but so were hobbits, right? Again, that's what Tolkien said in The Hobbit. There is little or no magic about them, except the ordinary, everyday sort, which helps them to disappear quietly and quickly when large, stupid folk like you and me come blundering along. Now, you may remember, in the prologue to The Fellowship of the Ring, Tolkien returns to this passage, or rather, he says something which seems to me to be a deliberate nod to this particular passage of The Hobbit, in saying that hobbits aren't magical, right? They're really, stealthy and small, and so they can disappear. They have increased the skill of disappearing quickly to a kind of professional skill. Hobbits are not magical. He's insisted in the prologue, in the Concerning Hobbits section, before the Fellowship of the Ring, but that wasn't what he said in The Hobbit, right? In The Hobbit, the question is left open. They have little or no magic about them. Oh, except for the ordinary everyday sort, right? What's the ordinary everyday sort of magic exactly? They do seem to have some kind of magic, I think, it seems, to suggest. And again, Tolkien backs off from that. But I think that that's a fascinating thing. Again, these two subspecies who are both physically different, whose hair patterns have changed, have become shorter, and laugh a lot, though they've also grown apart in different ways. Again, I'm not saying hobbits and Drûgs are the same. What's fascinating is just the fact that we have here two different examples of men who were presumably based upon the origin stories of the children of Ilúvatar that we get in the Silmarillion material. Presumably everybody is related to the same stock, right? There's a particular geographical place where the second children, the second comers of the children of Ilúvatar awaken and spread out from there. Presumably, the people of Hador and the Drûgs and the Hobbits and the Brelanders and the Dunlendings and the Easterlings and everybody else all came originally from the same group. What happened? And it was just looking at these. So this is where to me the comparison. You can see that Christopher Tolkien doesn't want anybody making any mistakes, and I can certainly believe him when he emphasizes that when he says my father was at pains to emphasize, right? I can certainly understand why he would want to defend against any misapprehension that the two are the same, or like closely related, or close cousins or something like that. But rather just the fact that this sort of thing happens because we don't get any clear sense of how this happens or why this happens. One other passage I wanted to go back to, we didn't talk about it at the time. The dwindling of the Drúedain, this is at the very end of the last appendix of the disaster of the Drûedain fields. The dwindling of the Drúedain was not a normal tendency shared by peoples whose proper home was Middle-earth, but due to the loss of their ancient realm in the west, nearest of all mortal lands to the undying realm. The much later dwindling of hobbits must be due to a change in their state and way of life. They became a fugitive and secret people, driven, as men, the big folk, became more and more numerous, usurping the more fertile and habitable lands, to refuge in forest or wilderness, a wandering and poor folk, forgetful of their arts, living a precarious life, absorbed in the search for food and fearful of being seen. Okay. This has always been one of the elements of Tolkien's subcreation that I personally have found least intuitive. I have a hard time investing myself imaginatively in this. I don't understand it. I don't get it. Why exactly when did hobbits get short? How do hobbits get short? Because however you slice it, it's in a really short, brief, I should say, perhaps, time frame, right? We're not talking about a slow evolution over tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. We're talking about an evolutionarily short window of time here, window of time, I'll keep the short jokes to a minimum, in which the hobbits are dwindling in stature. The fact that and notice how even this explanation, and this is, one of the most explicit explanations we ever get of this, and it's not much. This explanation, to me, goes in a circle, right? How did they become short? Due to a change in their state and way of life, they became a fugitive and secret people. Why? So becoming a fugitive and secret people made them get short, made them get small, made them diminish in stature. Why did they become secret and fugitive? Because the big folk became more and more numerous, usurping the more fertile and habitable lands. But wait, I thought they were big folk then, and they became little folk when they... I don't know. Now, again, I'm not trying to poke holes in this or make fun of it. And he never gives a mechanism. He never explains, by what process this happens. Was there some kind of supernatural intervention? Is this something that some elf does? In other fairy stories, one could imagine this. Is this something that the Valar do? Is this, part of the plan of Iluvatar? Presumably it is. I don't know. But we're never told about it. We never actually see that. No explanation of this is really given. And it's especially fascinating in this paragraph, in the context of what he says in the first half of the paragraph. He talks about, this all begins with, this is all in the appendix on the linear measurements of Númenor. Remember about the Ranga and all that stuff? And about how the men of Númenor got shorter. They were the tallest of all the humans. But they not only did their lifespans shrink. Remember Matt's chart of the reigning and the lifespans and the reigns of the kings of Númenor, right? And how they were already shrinking in lifespan. They diminish in physical stature in Middle Earth as well, so that the men of Gondor are still tall. They're not way taller than the people of Rohan, whereas Elendil the Tall was really tall. But anyhow. So they diminish. The hobbits diminish really fast. Now, when the Númenorians diminish, we're told it's not a normal tendency shared by people whose proper home was Middle-earth. It is due to the loss of their ancient realm in the west. That is to say, their height correlated with their longitude, right, with their westerliness. That is, their height was like their extended longevity, a gift of the Valar, or maybe like a side effect of the blessing of the Valar in some sense. So tallness correlates with blessing from the Valar. And that's something you can see pretty consistently. I mean, it's something that, over the years, many of my students have observed. Notice how you can always tell the leader when you come to a new group of people in Tolkien's world, you can usually pick out the captain or the king because he's the tallest. Éomer is the tallest, Faramir is the tallest. Even the kings of the elves are often taller. You're right, Brianna. Húrin being the exception, absolutely. But anyway, there's a very strong correlation between height and between physical stature and spiritual stature. But hobbits have always been a glaring exception to that rule, right? And so again, that's another way in which, like, I don't understand it physiologically. I don't quite understand it, sort of symbolically either. It's never something that I've really understood very fully. A couple, let's see, Thomas and Chuck were both sort of talking about how, maybe dwindling, the much later dwindling of hobbits, maybe the dwindling is referring to their numbers or to their extent rather than to their height. It's possible. I mean, goodness knows we are told that over time they're going to dwindle in terms of how numerous they are, and certainly to the amount of geography that they cover. But the whole context of this passage is about physical measurements and about height. And again, the context, which I haven't given you, is it's just been explaining why hobbits are called halflings, because they were more or less precisely half the height of a Númenorian. By Númenorian measures, they were half high. And so that name halfling was given them by the Númenorians, who knew of them way back at the beginning of the Third Age. And that although nobody in Gondor, Pippin is the first hobbit to be seen in Gondor, like ever, in the history of the South Kingdom, yet nevertheless, they've heard of the Perianeth. They know what a halfling is, and they already have a category for that. Anyways, again, it's in that context of talking about the height of hobbits that this paragraph comes in. So I do understand it as referring to their diminishing size, which brings me to an interesting point, which Sarah King has just brought up, and D. May was referring to earlier. A couple people have been alluding to, and I've been delaying mentioning. But I think it's really fascinating. There is, of course, a race of creatures in Tolkien's world which had been conceived initially as diminishing, as they sort of diminished in power and diminished in influence, as also diminishing in physical stature, not just to 3 feet high, but to inches high, even centimeters high, and those are elves. The diminishing of the elves was in the early conception. I'm talking Book of Lost Tales here. In the early conception was literal, because that was back before Tolkien decided to just rebel against the entire Victorian fairy tradition. That tradition, that post-Renaissance tradition of teensy little buttercup fairies and stuff. The Arthur Conan Doyle Tinkerbell kind of thing. That idea of fairies, the diminutive fairies, was initially something Tolkien kind of tried to sort of compromise with, or rather tried to incorporate into his own mythology. He still was seemed to be artistically interested in increasing the stature and dignity of elves, not just to make them teensy and cute and silly, but to make them noble and tragic. So we have the tragic stories, the Book of Lost Tales stories, the stories which become over time the Silmarillion stories, even the Turin story and all, stuff that we've been reading earlier in this class. He starts with those stories, but then eventually, at the end, talks about how the elves who remain in Middle-earth shrink. They physically diminish until they become the tiny little fairies that we're used to. So basically saying, yes, it's true. The only fairies that still exist in our world are the teensy ones that, your nurse taught you about, in the late Victorian era. But elves weren't always that way. And this is the ancient history of the elves. That's what we get. That's where Tolkien begins. Later on, he finally just put his foot down and said, screw it, I'm A, not using the word fairy anymore, period, and B, and certainly he's not going to use, and not only was he using the word fairy, he was using the word elfin with an F originally. He used it, not all the time, but frequently. Okay, no more elfin, no more fairies, it's just elves with a V, and this is why he invents a new adjective, elvish, instead of elfin, because again he didn't want those Victorian associations. Yana, the Arthur Conan Doyle thing is a reference to Arthur Conan Doyle. It wasn't about him writing fairy stories, but about him claiming to see fairies. And to release photographic evidence of fairies that he found. It's a thing about Arthur Conan Doyle. I don't even know all that much about it. It's something actually I've been meaning to read about more, because what I have read is pretty funny. But anyway, he was associated with them because he was, in his later life, was making this case for like the actual existence of fairies and claimed to have photographic evidence of it. It's pretty funny. Yeah. Charlie says it was made into a relatively recent movie. I didn't see that, Charlie, but yeah. Anyhow, okay. So, but anyway, the larger point I was making is that was the early part of Tolkien's mythology. The idea of the elves physically diminishing is removed from Tolkien's mythology, but then in the later portions of in the later development of Tolkien's mythology, we still get diminishing races, but now it's humans, right? So now instead of humans being this stable or in a sense like upwardly mobile race, as of course we all believe in the march of progress, and humans are evolving and getting better and better and smarter all the time, and the elves are diminishing and becoming small and funny. Well, now. In Tolkien's world, we have the reverse happening, right? Elves remain great, and in some sense are even like becoming greater. Like, they're over there in the West with the gods, right? With the Valar. And humans are diminishing, and some of them are diminishing really fast. And we see more than one example, right? Getting back to Drûgs, we see what happens with hobbits, we see what's happened with the Drûgs, we see there are sort of several examples of humanity moving in this very different direction. And again, it's not to say that hobbits and Drûgs are examples of de-evolution, right? Of sort of evolutionary regression or anything like that. But again, it's to me fascinating that whole sort of process gets put sort of on its head, and I think that's in the end kind of funny, actually. That's sort of ironic reversal. But what becomes clear is that humans are pretty plastic, pretty various. I mean, the physical differences among the races of humans, even humans in the non-Drûg, non-Hobbit category, are more extreme than we get among the elves. With the elves, it's like most of the elves don't have blonde hair, but this one family of elves do have blonde hair. That's like a major distinction among the different sort of families and species of elves. The men have very much greater delineations among them. Anyway, Back to those powers of the Drûgs, because I think that it's clear that although, somebody, and I've lost it now, it was a while back, Faye, maybe? No, Nancy. Sorry, good. Nancy Fosberg was pointing this out. But just as with the Hobbit, with the hobbits in the Hobbit description, he says, they have little or no magic except the ordinary, everyday kind, conceding the possibility of magic, but not making a big deal of it or sort of downplaying it. So too we have, the or we're credited with, right? This sort of uncertainty, not really coming out and firmly saying they totally have magic powers, at least not in that initial description. But we do see several interesting things about them. One thing, of course, is their power with their carvings, with their stones, and with those wonderful watch stones that we get, the statues of them, and the description of it, just in that passage at the end of the Faithful Stone, is fascinating on several levels. "I will speak when I have looked and thought longer," said Achan. I assume it's Achan with that same sound again. And he went hither and thither, scanning the ground, and Barach followed him. At length Achan led him to a thicket at the edge of the clearing in which the house stood. There the watchstone was, sitting on a dead orc, but its legs were all blackened and cracked, and one of its feet had split off and lay loose at its side. Achan looked grieved, but he said, "Ah well, he did what he could, and better that his legs should trample orc fire than mine." Then he sat down and unlaced his buskins, and Barach saw that under them there were bandages on his legs. Achan undid them. "They are healing already," he said. "I had kept vigil by my brother for 2 nights, and last night I slept. I awoke before morning came, and I was in pain, and found my legs blistered. Then I guessed what had happened. Alas, if some power passes from you to a thing you have made, then you must take a share in its hurts." If some power passes from you to a thing you have made, then you must take a share in its hurts. Okay. This is really fascinating. Neil, I know you were emailing me about this, and I was thinking the same thing. Doesn't this sound an awful lot like Sauron and the Ring? And of course, Christopher Tolkien talks about that, the connection between Sauron and the Ring and Sauron and the foundations of Barad-dûr. The way that when you allow some part of your power to go out of you and invest it into something else for whatever purpose you do that, there is still that connection back to you. So much of Sauron's power was put into the ring that he was permanently crippled by its destruction and could not be permanently crippled could not be permanently destroyed so long as the ring survived. Roy and Arthur and Annie were all thinking the same thing too as I was reading that. Yeah. So I think that it's on the one hand, a complete sidelight, right? It has nothing really directly to do with Drûgs. And instead, in one sense, this passage from this little Drúedain folk story shows us something that I think gives us some more insight into how the Ring of Power works than almost anything directly said about the Ring of Power. But I would also point to 2 other occasions in which we see similar but not exactly the same things. One is Turin's Black Sword. This passage wasn't in the Unfinished Tales version. This is part of the sort of the bit that he skips and draws our attention to the Silmarillion. Says, read the Silmarillion, these pages of the Silmarillion, because it's basically the same. And in particular here, I'm thinking of Beleg receiving the Black Sword from Thingol and Melian, and Melian warning him that part of the will of the smith, Eol, is in that sword. We know that Gurthang is a magic sword, and Melian suggests what she seems to point to is that what makes it a magic sword, and which also, by the way, would explain to some extent why it could talk at the end, is that part of the spirit, will, being of the smith, Eol, the Dark Elf, has gone into it. Eol, the Dark Elf, who of course learned much about smithcraft from the dwarves. So
does that mean that that's a dwarvish power? I mean, he has said, Tolkien said in that earlier description, that the power of the Drûgs is very unlike the power of the dwarves. But certainly the connection between the Drûgs and the Watchstones is... Roy says it's much more literal. I agree, Roy. I guess I'd say a little bit differently. It's much more personal, I think. Sauron makes the Ring of Power in order to use that to use the Ring of Power as a kind of lever in order to gain supremacy over the elven rings and over the wielders of the elven rings. The Drûgs pour themselves into the Watchstones with self-sacrificial intention. Of course, as we see, there is, in a sense, an unintended self-sacrificial result of Sauron pouring so much of himself into the Ring of Power, but it certainly wasn't intended as a self-sacrificial act on Sauron's part. It is, it seems, something of a self-sacrificial act on the part of the Drûgs. Anyway, so I think that we do see... We get a fascinating kind of glimpse here, but again, the way in which they exert their power seems to me also an important element in their, an important reflection of their character, of their culture. But of course, this is another one of those moments, like the things with Saruman we were talking about before, which I think when we look at this and we read stories like this, like the story of Achan and his statue, which go back and shine a new light on passages in The Lord of the Rings. Of course, obviously the one I'm thinking about is Merry here coming to Dunharrow. He was on a road the like of which he had never seen before, a great work of men's hands, and years beyond the reach of song. Upwards it wound, coiling like a snake, boring its way across the sheer slope of rock. Steep as a stair, it looped backwards and forwards as it climbed. Up it horses could walk, and wains could be slowly hauled, but no enemy could come that way, except out of the air, if it was defended from above. At each turn of the road there were great standing stones that had been carved in the likeness of men, huge and clumsy-limbed, squatting cross-legged with their stumpy arms folded on flat bellies. Some in the wearing of the years had lost all features, save the dark holes of their eyes, that still stared sadly at passers-by. The riders hardly glanced at them. The Pukul-men, they called them, and heeded them little. No power or terror was left in them, but Merry gazed at them with wonder and a feeling almost of pity, as they loomed up mournfully in the dusk. If we are to understand, as it seems we are to understand, at least this is how I take the stuff on the Drúedain, if we're to understand that these are watchstones, Drúedain watchstones, which have been set up, and again they seem to be, Merry recognizes, sees the similarity immediately to Chan Buri Khan, that, it looks, this is clearly a statue of, these are statues of Drûgs, and thus presumably watchstones. Dunharrow was pretty freaking well defended. I mean, if it was defended from above, no enemy could come at it that way. It wouldn't even have to be defended from above. Just walk away, right? I mean, you've got the statues at every turn in the road, right? You've got this army of watchstones on that path. Forget about it, man. Nobody's getting up there. And presumably nobody's getting down either. We also are told, of course, in the course of these essays that... in the course of the writings on the Drúedain, it's not exactly an essay, that the Drúedain were unfriends, at the least, were enemies with the other men, the other Easterlings that were in this area, that is, presumably with the Oathbreakers back in the day, back before they became ghosts. Those were exactly the kinds of men, the men out of the East who were under Sauron's sway, with whom the Drúedain the Drúedain of the White Mountains were said to be at war. And we know that the Paths of the Dead are which are now called the Paths of the Dead, and presumably prior to Isildur were not called the Paths of the Dead because they weren't guarded by dead people yet, because those people were still alive. Back when the dead people were still alive, this pass was a direct pass between where the Drúedain apparently lived. I mean, if we are to conclude anything from the Púcal Men statues, clearly this was a place of theirs, and they were not friendly with the men who live on the other side of that pass through the mountains or in the mountains. That's Tom says the paths of the not dead yet. Exactly. So again, it notice how this is one of the things that I find most fun about this. As Tolkien is kind of rounding out things, as he's kind of filling up the corners, as I said in my somewhat whimsical, though not quite so whimsical as I almost made it, title of my class tonight, we have him taking a story, taking a concept, an idea, a character from the Lord of the Rings, and telling us more, feeding us some just a little bit extra to help us imaginatively fill in the time around this. We see the way that it works. He tends to first he fills it in he fills it in sort of around them, right? That is around them where they are. And then, he projects outwards first, right? We get a wider picture of the people and their culture, and then he projects backwards in time, right? Backwards into the history. They're the first to cross the Anduin, their connection with the people of with Haleth, and of course, the way in which they were going to be reworked back into the Silmarillion. They're not in the Silmarillion. Why? Right? Because they hadn't been invented when that stuff was mostly written. He would have had to go back and rewrite a bunch of the Silmarillion stuff to include Drûgs among all of those places where Drûgs were supposed to be. And of course, you recall, I hope that you noted, Neil, I know that you did, the one particular and most forceful intervention he was going to make into the Silmarillion, of Drûgs into the Silmarillion tradition. Sador Hoppafoot from the Turin story was going to be a Drûg. Christopher just drops that in one of the notes, right? That he knows that it was, he knows that it was his father's intention to go back and retroactively make Sador Hoppafoot a Drûg. Wow, that's a big change, actually. I'm fascinated. Trying to imagine how the Turin story would be different if one of the primary influences on his youth was a Drûg, rather than the Sador that we get. Is a fascinating pool of speculation based upon what we know of them here, to try to take the characteristics of the Drûgs as we learn about them here and put that back into Turin's childhood. I don't know. Yeah, Nancy says it totally changes the meaning of his reaction when he's called a Woodwose. Yeah, and not to mention that, Nancy, remember, Woodwose is the name he takes for himself when he gets to the people of Haleth at the end. He calls himself Wild Man of the Woods. In other words, Woodwose, right? That's his name. That's the he's called Turambar also, but he calls himself Woodwose, right? So yeah, Nancy, it would be going back to his going back to his youth. Yes. Anyway, my initial reaction, well, it's hard to say because I can't really imagine how the Turin story would be different. I mean, it seems to me like Turin's character would almost have to be completely different. Not completely different, but significantly different if he were influenced by... Sador's pretty different from the Drûgs in a bunch of ways. And I don't know. I mean, one of the things that I really like about Sador is the way, I talked about the sort of the elegance of the story as we get it in the Unfinished Tales version, further put together and expanded in the Children of Húrin version. With the parallels of Sador at the beginning and Brondir at the end, you got the limping guys and and the way in which Sador serves as a kind of foil for Turin at the beginning, and Brandir is kind of his opposite at the end. The way that these things contribute to the overall shape of the story, and then with the Woodwoes thing, right? The thing with Cyros, and then the thing with him taking the name Woodwoes at the end, right at the time when he meets one of the daughters of the children of Haleth, running like a deer, clad only in her hair. Again, so many lovely parallels, and the structure is so elegant. Turning Sador into a Drûg really changes a bunch of these things. But anyway, I won't. I won't go into more of this. Right, see, Alyssa, exactly. I was thinking the same thing. How would Sador Drûg would have lost one of his foot? Would he have lost it the way with stomping orc fire, the way that Achan's watchstone did? His watchstone stomped so much orc fire that his foot fell off, and I mean. Yeah, that's. I mean, of course, Alyssa. I was thinking of the footless statue too when I was thinking about Drûg Sador, But goodness, what a difference! What a difference between, a Drûg who has been so faithful and self-sacrificial that he has been personally maimed as a consequence of his faithful service and devotion, compared to Sador Hoppafoot, who fled from his destiny and only ran to meet it faster and was, dismembered by his own incompetence. Anyway, I mean, it's very different, and I can't even wrap my head around it, so I'm going to stop trying. But anyway, but it's characteristic of something that we've seen in this stuff all the way. Remember with Galadriel, right? It was the same thing. Galadriel first projected outward, right? First, let's round out more the role that Galadriel obviously would have played, in the Second and Third Age, building up to this story. The whole larger story of Sauron and the resistance to Sauron. We first project her outwards into that. That's Galadriel 2.0, right? Then, now we got to project backwards, right? No, now given who she is, now we have to invent a whole backstory, and we first quietly integrate her, again in Galadriel 2.0, into the Silmarillion story. But then in Silmarillion 3.0 especially, we have to violently alter the Silmarillion story in order to accommodate the character of Galadriel as she has now been developed. So too, we see a similar pattern happening with the Drûgs there. Charlie, that is a good point. Implacable in hatred does sound a lot like Turin. Yeah, but I don't know. In some way, see, my problem is the more I keep thinking about it, I'm like, man, if Turin grew up with a Drûg mentor, I mean, unless he happened to have a really bad Drûg mentor, an unusually unrepresentative Drûg mentor, you got to think he would have learned a lot of the lessons that he really screwed up later in life. But anyhow, I think I'm definitely not going to get to the Blue Wizards tonight, but I do at least want to finish talking about Drûgs. The other thing we get of them is their prophecy. In the Annals of Númenor, it is said that this remnant, there were some Drûgs that came to the final settlement, the final refugee camp of Beleriand, at the Isle of Valar. It is said that this remnant was permitted to sail over sea with the Atani, and in the peace of the new land, that is Númenor, throve and increased again, but took no more part in war, for they dreaded the sea. What happened to them later is only recorded in one of the few legends that survived the downfall, the story of the first sailings of the Númenorians back to Middle-earth, known as the Mariner's Wife. Now we have the story of the Drûgs going backwards and retroactively altering the unpublished story of Aldarion and Erendis from Part 2 of Unfinished Tales, right? Of course, there's no reference in Aldarion and Erendis to Drûgs of any kind, because they still hadn't been invented when he was writing that story. But now they're being retroactively inserted into that story also. In a copy of this, written and preserved in Gondor, we have an alternative manuscript of Aldarion and Erendis that includes Drûgs. There is a note by the scribe on a passage, and by the way, this is exactly, again, Tolkien was such a good scholar, this is exactly one of the things that we get, when you do medieval scholarship, sometimes some of the most valuable things are not just the primary text that's been copied by a scribe, but the stuff that the scribe off his own bat scrawls in the margin. This is why we have the text of the earliest Christian English poem ever written, Caedmon's Hymn. Caedmon's Hymn, the poem which the bard Caedmon spontaneously sings in response to the angelic voice, who tells him to sing a song of the creation, is the story is told by the Venerable Bede, and how Caedmon was responsible for composing all of these awesome biblical poems in Anglo-Saxon verse. Except the whole thing's in Latin. It just gives a Latin paraphrase of the song that Caedmon sang. It gives like a prose Latin translation of Caedmon's song. The only reason we have the Anglo-Saxon version is that one of the manuscripts of Bede, in one of the scribe, who is obviously an Anglo-Saxon himself, wrote in the margin the Anglo-Saxon version of Caedmon's Hymn, and that's why we have Caedmon's Hymn. So Tolkien has inserted one of these similarly serendipitous scribal remnants into one of the fictitious manuscript copies of The Mariner's Wife, which has survived in Gondor. There is a note by the scribe on a passage in which the Drúedain in a household of King Aldarion the Mariner are mentioned. It relates that the Drúedain, who were ever noted for their strange foresight, were disturbed to hear of his voyages, foreboding that evil would come of them, and begged him to go no more. But they did not succeed, since neither his father nor his wife could prevail on him to change his courses, and the Drúedain departed in distress. From that time onward, the Drúedain of Númenor became restless, and despite their fear of the sea, one by one, or in twos and threes, they would beg for passages in the great ships that sailed to the northwestern shores of Middle-earth. If any asked, "Why would you go, and whither?" they answered, "The great isle no longer feels sure under our feet, and we wish to return to the lands whence we came." Okay. Nancy says, knowing this, it makes me happy that Christopher tells us when he is transcribing something from Tolkien's margins. Yes, that happens a lot. Yeah. Anyway, Drûgs. Among the Númenóreans, remember, we have, starting with Aragorn and working backwards through his grandparents, right? We have this reference to the tendency of the Dúnedain, of the men of Westerness, to have foretellings, right? To be foresighted in this way. And we see this in Aldarion and Arendis, right? We have foresightings come upon them at various times. That they're able to foretell. Happens with Aldarion's mom, right? Isn't that right? Am I remembering that correctly? Isn't she the one who does a foresight thing, or is it Arendis' mom? Somebody's mom, isn't it? Somebody's mom does some foretelling. I'm already forgetting. It's so sad. But anyway, among the Númenóreans, though, the Drûgs are famous for being foresighted, right? They are able to foretell things even more clearly than the Númenóreans were, such that they're here you go. It's like a really geeky idiom substitution, right? Next time you're tempted to say like rats out of a sinking ship. Instead, say like Drûgs out of Númenor. I'm sure that'll go over really well in party conversation. Anyway. Arthur asks, why is their foresight described as strange? I think strange, that's what I take noted for their strange foresight. It's strange. It's notable even among them, like that they foresee things more, either differently potentially, and also more persistently, more consistently. I'm not sure, but more than the Númenóreans do. As clearly, they see where things are going. I mean, the great isle no longer feels sure under our feet. This puppy's going down, and we can tell hundreds of years in advance, right? Yeah. Drûgs out of Númenor, exactly. Of course, the other point, and I want to just touch on this briefly, which is, I think, so essential, and so non-Turin-like, of the Drûgs, is how they are servants, how we see them submit themselves to be servants. This sort of sense of self-sacrifice, of giving themselves to the service of others, seems to be something which is a central part of their culture. And it's fascinating because this is another thing which I think, it's not that it's, the laughter of the Drûgs seems to me an embellishment of, and really kind of a shifting of that one detail that we get in The Return of the King about Clann Chan. But this aspect of their culture seems to be something of which we don't get any hint in The Lord of the Rings, but which is in fact in some ways contrary to what we might expect. Given what we hear about Clann Chan, I would expect that the Drûgs would be keeping to themselves, right? That they would be this very isolated people that barely ever come into contact with anybody else. That hide in the deepest wood, and whose name is a mere legend and rumor to everybody around them. In fact, that's not what we see. We see them coming out of the woods all the time to ally themselves with people. We see them seeking out others who are not of their race in order to help them in what seems to be a perfectly altruistic way. And that is an aspect of their culture which I wouldn't really have expected. But again, like so many of these things which Tolkien adds on to the Lord of the Rings stories, when you take that add-on and then you go back to the story, all of a sudden new things open up that didn't seem to be necessarily clearly there originally. By the way, you will have noticed that I couldn't resist. I was indulging in some highly puerile Drûgs puns. I was tempted to title this class "Say Yes to Drûgs." I restrained myself from doing that. I also was tempted to quote the passage about the inveterate warfare between the orcs and the Drûgs, just so that I could subtitle the slide, "The War on Drûgs," but I didn't. But anyway, this last one is my favorite. It is said that when the Eorlingas came out of the north and passed at length up the Snowbourn, seeking strong places of refuge in time of need, Brago and his son Baldur climbed the stair of the hold, and so came before the door. On the threshold sat an old man, aged beyond guess of years. Tall and kingly he had been, but now he was withered as an old stone. Indeed, for stone they took him, for he moved not, and he said no word until they sought to pass him by and enter. And then a voice came out of him, as it were out of the ground, and to their amaze it spoke in the western tongue. "The way is shut." Then they halted, and looked at him, and saw that he lived still, but he did not look at them. "The way is shut," his voice said again. "It was made by those who are dead, and the dead keep it until the time comes. The way is shut." "And when will that time be?" said Baldur. But no answer did he ever get, for the old man died in that hour, and fell upon his face, and no other tidings of the ancient dwellers in the mountains have our folk ever learned. Yet maybe at last the time foretold has come, and Aragorn may pass. Now, in the context of The Return of the King, it is never made explicit, it is never even suggested that the old man in question has anything in common, either with anything physically in common, either with the Púcal men or with the wild men of the woods. That connection is not made. The only connection is by sort of accident of geography, that this old man was there, it was near the Púcal men. But again, the connection is never asserted. But doesn't it sound like a Drûg? In the way that is the description of how perfectly still it sits, how they take it for stone, and how it doesn't move, how a voice comes out of it as it were out of the ground, and not only that, but I know it says he's tall. I'm not saying that I think that Tolkien at the time that he wrote this in The Lord of the Rings was was thinking of this as the same kind of person as Khan Buri Khan, but but I can't read the Drúedain when I talked about how so many of the details we get about the Drúedain in this chapter come from these passages in the Return of the Ring, about the Púcal Man and especially about Khan Buri Khan. This is the only reference we get to that, what is heavily emphasized in the Drúedain stuff about how still they can stand, and about, how they can be mistaken for statues and everything else. Brianna says maybe he's a very important kingly Drûg, so he's taller. Maybe. But anyhow, again, the thing is, the point that I'm trying to make is not that this guy was conceived to be of the same people as Khan Buri Khan at the time of the writing of The Return of the King, but rather, it seems to me almost inescapable that these details that are given about this guy, who wasn't a wild man of the woods, presumably because of his height, when it was originally written, nevertheless inform his description of the Drúedain, is being kind of brought into the pot, into this new little cauldron of story that Tolkien is brewing as he is expanding on this idea of the wild men. And so, in a sense, it's like retroactively this guy becomes a Drûg. Because you notice not only does he have those physical characteristics, but as if we can overlook his height. But even, to me, the description of how and why the Drûgs act, reminds me, or rather helps me to understand better, or even prompts me to ask and therefore to answer a question which I never asked when I was just reading The Return of the King. And that is, why did this guy do this? I had sometimes asked, who was this guy? I had never asked, why is he? What's his purpose? Why was he sitting there in order to deliver this warning, this prophecy, to the Rohirrim, to Brago and Balder, and then die? In the context of the description that we get of the Drûgs, it seems relatively clear, right? Again, if we associate this guy with the Drûgs, as so much as almost every element of his description, except for that one word tall, as almost every other element of his description invites us to do, if we connect him with the Drûgs, this does sound like something that a Drûg would do. Right, to say, I'm going to sit here and wait. I'm going to post myself as a sentry outside this gate to make sure that nobody wanders in, to make sure that nobody comes in here to, not knowing what they're getting into, and runs afoul of the dead. I have a foretelling that I have to deliver. And the motivation for it seems to be primarily benevolent. Right? I mean, again, that he's warning the Rohirrim for their own good. Balder, of course, will have none of it, and he's going to go in anyway. But of course, he is the exception, which really proves the rule about what the function that he was serving in warning people off. Anyway, I find this story fascinating when I go back and look at this in the context of the Drúedain stuff. Both Yana and Sarah were both asking, might he just have been a watchstone? Conceivably. I don't know about the functioning of watchstones after the Drûg that makes them has died, if they become inert in some sense, or if their power remains with them. Perhaps we could say that as Sarah King was saying, the voice really did come from the ground, perhaps, in the sense that it's coming out of a stone. Except, again, the description of him as being tall and kingly makes him the more unlike the Pukelmen as they're described. So I think certainly the chapter, the description in The Return of the King, this as written as part of The Return of the King, not as later reconceived or recontextualized, but conceived in its initial context, is clearly distinguished from the Pukelmen, and the description of him is nothing like the Pukelmen. But I think we could understand it in either way, really, but either way sort of says the same thing. I mean, it says that he died in that hour. Therefore, I take that to mean that he was not in fact a statue, that there was in fact a corpse to be dealt with and hopefully buried in honor by Brego and Baldur after this. That's how I've always understood that passage. And yes, it is very Watchstone-esque, Yana, as you say. It's but that's of course the point that the Drúedain chapter makes about them, right? The Watchstones are the way they are because they're a lot like the Drúedain, who are a lot like the Watchstones, right? Anyway, yeah. So there's Oh, and good. And Roy points out that he's described as withered, of course, too, which a stone wouldn't be withered. It might be weathered, but not withered in the same way. He does seem to be. I mean, we seem to have a person who has sat there into extreme old age for the purpose only of delivering this warning and then dying. And he dies because he's completed his task. And who knows how long he's lived there, waiting for them to come and for him to deliver his final message. But again, when I come back to that passage after the Drúedain chapter, it looks really different to me. I would, I'd be willing to put money on the proposition that if Tolkien had revised, done any kind of extensive revision on the text of The Return of the King after he wrote the Drúedain stuff, he would have removed the tall and kingly bit. Just a guess. But the resonance is to me really clear. Anyhow, I'll let you guys go. I've kept you for a long time. We will do the Blue Wizards next time, and of course we'll talk about Saruman and Gandalf as well. Again, we have class next Tuesday and next Tuesday night and next Wednesday afternoon to finish up Unfinished Tales. We will certainly talk about the Astari on Tuesday, finish up whatever we don't get to about the Astari, and talk about the Palantiri on Wednesday. Do email me with any questions that you have. I would be happy to try to integrate your questions, if we can, into our discussion. So thanks very much for joining me. Don't forget, if you haven't voted yet, vote. Right, vote on the next class. Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card, The Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula Le Guin, or Watership Down by Richard Adams. Those are our three options. So if you have a vote, vote. You've been recently sent an email by Ed Powell. The voting is going to close. The voting is going to close on tomorrow night, late tomorrow night, midnight Eastern time tomorrow night. So you have basically 24 hours from now in which to still vote. So, okay. Arthur says you should vote for all three, and thus equilibrium is maintained. Is that a vote for Earthsea? Anyway, thanks very much, everybody. We do have also a Riddles in the Dark this Friday. Don't forget about that. 10 a.m. on Friday, we will be talking about the plot trajectory of the third film. We'll be thinking about the shape of the narrative and the story there is to tell, with specific focus being to the beginning of the story. Where is the third film going to start? So don't forget, we will be doing Riddles in the Dark Friday at 10. Unfinished Tales closing up next week. Voting for the next Mythgard Academy class by tomorrow. All kinds of announcements today. So thanks, everybody, and I hope you will be able to to join in on some or all of those things. Thanks for joining me tonight and being patient with my really long class and my Drûg puns, which amused me much more than they probably should have. Thank you very much, everybody. Good night.